So, how is everybody doing in the midst of chaos world? After years of explaining things, do you, or at least some of you, are you beginning to understand what I've been saying to you? When you look around the world, and you look in your institutions, your organizations, your companies, here and around the world, you look at governments, what are you seeing? Are you seeing sound thinking? Are you seeing wisdom, understanding, humility, truth? Or are you seeing the opposite? See, these things do not happen at a vacuum. And when you think about it, there is a reason, a root causality for all these things. So let's just focus here in America, for instance. For years, I've been telling you that you cannot continue to govern this nation within the context of your polarities. And the reason why I tell you that, and I've been saying that, is that what that does is it creates an environment of only more unsound thinking, unwise actions, and choices and decision making, amplifying the severity of the absurdities going on, creating more chaos and more complexity. And you know why that is the case? You know, I've said this 1,000 times. Pride, fear, confusion, a lack of vision, and a brazenness by those that are doing it, that there'll be no consequences for it. Yet that is precisely what is beginning to happen at scale, is it not? There's not a single problem that we're dealing with in the nation that couldn't be at least mitigated for the good of the nation and all the people in the nation, generally speaking. But you won't allow it to happen, now will you? Instead, you've doubled down, and I warned you that if you doubled down and you continue down that path, that the consequences would scale, the complexities would go exponential, and that eventually they would expose you. And that's precisely what's happened and happening. You see, you don't realize how predictable you've become in those things. And sadly, you're still doing the very things that are continuing to worsen the predicament. Now, there are many that have awakened from their slumber and sobered up from their stupor and are beginning to look at things differently. But the fact remains is that the predicament is what it is. And what I warned you about, you're proving. Just as a valley cannot exist without the mountains, a nation cannot remain divided and hope to actually avert its own disasters. So you need to consider that in light of why it is I'm constantly saying to you that you have to have a true middle. And that because of the chronic state of your system as it currently is functioning, you have continued to go down the primrose path. And because of it, it's becoming very obvious what the outcomes of those decisions are. So when you have been warned and you continue to go down the same path, what do you think is going to happen? You think denial is going to make the problems go away? Or are you going to create more problems in your denial because denial is part of the problem? You can only keep people so long in a state of perpetual confusion, chaos, fear, lies, and crisis, and expect to maintain anything rational, cogent, and salvageable. Now, I have pretty much ignored all the electioneering madness. I generally stay away from the circus tent, or better said, the theater of politics, because of the circustry. And I ignore the news thereof, not because I don't understand politics. You're past a political solution when you're continuing to deny the root causalities of your problems. But what little I've been exposed to is that no one has a plan. People like to use the word plan. They like to pretend like they know what they need to do. But when you actually ask people what needs to be done, if nothing else, to break their pattern of screaming and bitching and yelling about what's wrong, there's so many people that suddenly go deaf, dumb, and silent. Because the truth of the matter is they have focused so much on the problems, or what they think are problems, and projecting upon one side or the other of their political simulacrum here, that they've not been able to extract themselves from that to move to a solution set. So when they are asked, so tell me, what's your plan? They can't tell you. But they're sure that the other guy or the other side, their plans are wrong. So you're in paralysis. So if no one has a plan, or no one on either side of the spectrum, and I use that for effect, the word spectrum, with intent on it having many meanings in the applied sense. Where's your plan? What I see a great deal of the time is I see a lot of things that have been done simply because of unsound thinking, a lot of pride, avarice, hubris, fear, and confusion. And the people that are still in that space are wrecking your country and driving the rest of everybody else deeper into those kinds of paradigms as well. And that is it's a feedback loop. And feedback loops tend to self-amplify. And self-amplification of a feedback loop, right, also intensifies the effects thereof. And what we would call that in weather is a vortex, or vortices if they're combined in multiple ways, right? And that's called a tempest, a storm, a whirlwind. A small scale of that would be a tornado. Big scale of that would be a typhoon or a hurricane. And it's precisely what happens, metaphorically, when you sow the wind. And when you continue sowing the wind, what do you think is going to happen, metaphorically and literally, in your society? Well, the ensuing chaos and destruction playing out in it will either wake enough people up to change the paradigm, or it will destroy your society completely eventually. In a very real sense, that's why I'm continuously saying to you that if we are as a nation to overcome our problems, our challenges, our divisions, our insanities, our desolations, our dissipation, it's going to take humility from both sides to avoid the calamities that both have sown. Because doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results, is insanity. And that's what I mean by you're at a point where you can no longer continue to do that without bringing on calamity. And those calamities are evident. The question is, how many calamities is it going to take by your own choices, your own decisions, and own actions, and your own divisions to break your pride, your avarice, and your hubris? Or are you going to go all the way down to the dust of the ground and meet your shadow with it because you would prefer, right, to do that than to let go? Now, when I talk about a vision, a plan, right, it's something that involves the entire country. It's not just something, right, that is fashioned by a certain group of people in an ivory tower disconnected from the totality of the rest. But yet, that is what most people do. That's what most people choose. And with that comes the consequences. So, as we're sitting here having this conversation, if you want to think on that, right? You have a great opportunity to wake up as a nation and realize that you have actually more in common than you do otherwise. And that if you continue down the path you're on, by focusing on your differences and the problems alone, you'll never get to a solution set. But you will get to a greater series of calamities. Now, I personally think that we can avoid a lot of them. And it's my hope that enough people will be willing to actually do that. But your machine is breaking down. And your machine-like thinking is not sufficient enough to change the paradigm this time. Because you live in a world, on an earth, a planet, that's not a machine. Now, I could sit here and go into a dissertation and lecture you about the predicaments you're in, both domestically and internationally, and why that is, and what could be done. And what most will do if I did that, they will just take it and they will go and do their own will, right? And they'll screw it up even worse. So the best thing that could happen to you as a country is you continue to experience your consequences until you're willing to actually choose a different path. And I think that you've reached a point where so many people are fed up with you in Washington. And in many cases with many parts of the private sector as well. But perhaps you don't comprehend the predicament as it actually is. I will tell you this, that typically in the trajectory that you're on, because you're running out of options, the temptation is to get into more wars, to divert the public. That's not going to suffice this time either, the way that you're doing things. You're at a juxtaposition now, where the cost of holding on to your pride and doing things your way is meeting the wall of the law of diminishing returns. And the cost of letting go of it is a better investment. But that's in a rational world, and you live in anything but a currently rational world. So what generally happens when you have an irrational world, and irrationality begins to be called rational, you exponentially increase the severity of your predicament and the costs thereof. Just like the intensity of the rain that's going on all around me, you can probably hear right now. It's getting more and more intense. And being that I'm sitting here under an umbrella looking at the pool, the waters are less and less serene and more chaotic. And when I look at that, that's exactly what I see in culture and in the thinking of people that are still doing things their own way according to their own wisdom and their own works. In fear and confusion and in pride. Continuing down the primrose path into the sea of chaos that they're creating by remaining there. So if I were to show you a video of this, you'd see what I mean, why I'm using this as a metaphor for you. But it's actually more than just a metaphor. It's actually a fractal pattern in nature that exemplifies what's happening in the nature of human beings in their mortal flesh and thinking. It is not just symbolic, it's a unity of both literal and figurative. It's a signal. And when I tell you that you live in a bigger reality, a superpositional reality, and there's a war going on in that superpositional reality, and that war is first and foremost meta war, spiritual war, ideological. And you continue to disconnect that from the totality of everything else in creation, including the biosphere, by making excuses and only seeing it from a mechanistic point of view or a scientific point of view, and then corrupting your science along with it. You are choosing to be blind to something that is plainly obvious to you as it picks up in amplitude. And that is, nothing happens here in a vacuum. All throughout history, when great evil has taken hold of the peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations, there are also great problems within the biosphere, because the biosphere reacts to what humanity does. Everything's connected. You like to think of it the other way around, and in a mixture. But the truth of the matter is that you're looking at it in error. And because you're only willing to look at it from a mechanistic, left hemispheric dominant perspective, you do not comprehend the reality of what you're actually in. And because you're doing that, you're making more and more unsound decisions, increasing the chaos thereof, feeding the entire cycle, not only throughout the peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations, but also in the biosphere itself. Because you've been lied to, you've been deceived, many have been deceived, and many are in denial of, or utterly blind to, the fact that all things are connected here. So when you consider what I'm telling you, there's an interplay of things that you grasp a little bit of, and then you think that you have the totality of it. And then you're too arrogant to admit to yourself and others that you actually see less than what you think you do. And your decisions are less informed than you think they are. And so the costs of that increase, they scale exponentially to your pride, your denial, and your refusal to actually look at things as they are and call them out as they really are. Now that's darkness, and that leads to destruction. You see, the world is, and I mean the totality, both the biosphere and human civilizations, collectively are at once both more complex and more simple. But what people do is they oversimplify and they overcomplicate. That's reality here. You are creating a greater reality of chaos and confusion and evil because you're choosing to do the things that you were warned against. And there are many reasons for that, which I've talked about in many ways across disciplines, philosophically, theologically, existentially. And the reason why it is that you remain on the path that you are is that you continue to follow your shadow right into the dust of the ground, refusing to listen, being slaves to lies and your own pride and the fear and confusion that births the divisions, the chaos, and the destruction out of it. And that is all of human history. That is your human history playing out. That is what you do when you reject objective truth and you even corrupt the things that you did know and you do have an understanding of, and you misappropriate knowledge and a lack of wisdom and vision, and you misapply it, you misuse it, you mislead yourselves and others with it, worsening your predicament. Again, look at your world. There are consequences for these things. And since everything is about money in this world, well, the costs versus the return on investment is not a good set of variables for you remaining in that predicament. That's why ultimately your predicament will break you and humble you. It will force you to look at things differently, or it will destroy you. And it will do it at scale. So consider these things and consider why I'm always talking about, as it is for people, so too it is for nations. and look at people and look at what's happening among the nations and all the things that are in nations, governments, institutions, corporations, you name it. Nothing is left untouched. And then you tell me how wise your leaders, yourselves, in many cases, are. And why it is that so many will not even consider the things I'm talking about as a possibility, even though their predicament grows more severe. And then remember that I told you that it's because of pride.